briefly outline the implications for the use of informal educational institutions as a mechanism for implementing Pan-Africanism and achieving sustainable development. So, when we start to talk about education, society, and transformation, as a repository of society's principles, values, history, and culture, education is responsible for shaping, directing, and reinforcing the community's structures, leaders, governments, and inner workings. Unquestionably, the access and content of education can be detrimental to the overall quality of life. Integral to all societies, education can be transmitted in different forms and throughout a lifespan. It is transmitted through various avenues such as oral history, the media, folklore, cultural expressions, and formal schooling. It is used as a vehicle as the means of delivering norms, values, traditions, and roles. Theoretically, education should develop citizens and community members who are full contributors to their community's development. Likewise, the community or society's collective values and principles are formed as a result of consolidating individuals throughout thought and understanding. National awareness or consciousness is driven by the content of the curriculum presented within formal and informal institutions. Education can be used as a mechanism to reinforce the status quo or challenge a ruling class. Max Engelhardt describes education as a fluid process disseminated through diverse channels. He says, all activities in which an individual participates are educative. If the activities are undertaken spontaneously with no conscious recognition of an educative purpose on the part of the individual or others influencing him, the development resulting constitutes purely informal education. If the activities are engaged in for the express purpose of acquiring abilities useful in future activities, and the development constitutes formal education. Engelhardt's definition of education leads the researcher to conclude that education both in and out of the classroom contributes to the development of the individual, community, and society. As such, the degree of sustainable development is contingent on the quality and quantity of education in a given society. Additionally, providing culturally and historically aligned educational content impacts the sustainable development options. There is a direct link between individual consciousness derived through education and the political milieu and ideology of society. Sekou Touré, in his work, Revolution, Culture, and Pan-Africanism, articulates the link between these two entities. He says that society and the individual should not be looked upon as entities that are abstract, exclusive, and separate. Neither the individual nor the society could stand one without the other. They are indissolubly linked up. One and the other have external, physical, and material aspects. Both are subject to habits, customs, rights, and practices. Individuals directly contribute to the development of society through their labor and culture, which is often crafted during their educational experience. Education as a component of culture can be utilized to determine the balance of power and the individual's relationship to the mode of thinking and their relationships to the mode of production. Culture, as defined by Sekou Touré, is the sum of the gains, knowledge, modes of action, enabling man to regulate his conduct, his relationships with other men, and his relationships with nature. It is through culture that society creates and develops, expresses itself. It defines a level of general consciousness, technical and technological capability, the modes of organization, the principles of action, the objectives which guide society in its struggle for an always new and brighter future. Particularly in recent history, education has been used as a pacifying agent and has reinforced the exploitation of the majority of the people. However, it can be used as a humanistic and liberating force of change that seeks to empower rather than to dominate and to humanize. This framework views consciousness as an intention and advocate towards the world, and thus its development is a paramount necessity. Paulo Freire promotes the notion of liberating education in his work, The Politics of Education and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where he agrees that education can be used to fuel society with politically conscious individuals. I'll now move on to Ghana informal education and Pan-Africanism. Kwame Nkrumah believed that Pan-Africanism was a solution to the struggles that African people faced worldwide. He believed that the total unification and liberation of Africa was the only way to rid the African continent of colonization. His experiences abroad and contribution to the Fifth Pan-African Congress solidified the fact that Pan-Africanism was the correct direction for Africa and African people. In the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, Nkrumah says that at the core of the concept of African unity lies socialism and the socialist definition of the new African society. Socialism and African unity are organically complementary. It is important to clarify that Nkrumah was specifically working towards transforming Africa's economic system, from one that was unhumanistic to one that relied on humanist principles. His belief that the only way to defeat imperialism was through unification drove his internal and external policies. Again, in the Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, he states this about a union government. It therefore follows that the unity of the African people expressed in a union government is necessary to A. Articulate the liberation struggle in territories still under colonial domination, for the security of already independent states, and particularly for those which have chosen to follow a line of total opposition to imperialism, and C. To protect the flanks of our drive towards socialist domestic reconstruction. Nkrumah and the CPP's dedication to Pan-Africanism led to the above-mentioned key elements which were reinforced throughout his tenure in Ghana. The CPP and Nkrumah hosted several All-African People's Conferences and other significant continent-wide conferences in Ghana. In addition, the country offered free education to freedom fighters and nationalists throughout the African world, but particularly on the African continent. And you can think of Julius Nyerere and a couple of other folks that moved on to be the presidents of their nations, and they actually gained education in Ghana. Resting on the shoulders of the African masses worldwide, Pan-Africanism to Nkrumah was the most viable solution, but not necessarily the easiest to implement. Nkrumah believed that in order for Pan-Africanism to come to fruition, it had to be embraced by the African masses, including those in the African diaspora. The CPP government sought to expose Ghanaians and Africans alike to Pan-Africanism through political education through their informal institutions. Although not explicitly identified, it appears that Nkrumah and the CPP were hopeful that the African masses would embrace Pan-Africanism and begin to become active partners in the development of the African world. Nkrumah's understanding of Pan-Africanism involved the thought that imperialism should be eradicated, neocolonialism should be recognized and eliminated, and that the new African nation should be developed within a continental framework. The eradication of foreign domination is essential due to the historical relationship between development and or lack thereof and domination by external governments. As an example, the assimilation of the oppressed has been the objective of colonizers even as independence was won or granted. Forced to embrace, through the formal and informal education system, a foreign culture, language, morals, and values, generally the colonized abandoned their traditional mode of thinking. Introduced through education campaigns, the colonizing nation reinforces the need for oversight by non-indigenous people. Cheikh Anta Diop agrees that colonization drastically alters the direction of the colonized in his book, Civilization or Barbarism, where he states, "We have said earlier that a people without a historical conscience is a population. The loss of national sovereignty and of historical conscience following a prolonged foreign occupation engenders stagnation or even sometimes regression, disintegration, and a partial return to barbarism." Diop, much like Nkrumah, believed that the psychological effects of colonialism would dictate the direction of the African continent and African people. As such, Nkrumah and the CPP sought to provide opportunities for individuals and communities to embrace an alternate way of thinking. Rooted in African philosophy and ideology, Pan-Africanism countered the implementation of foreign systems in independent Africa. Frantz Fanon, in 1964, and towards the African Revolution, strengthened the argument for abandoning the inherited foreign mode of operation. He says, "True liberation is not that pseudo-independence in which ministers having limited responsibility hobnob with an economy dominated by the colonial pact. Liberation is the total destruction of the colonial system from the preeminence of the language of the oppressor and departmentalization to the customs union that in reality maintains the former colonized in the meshes of the culture, of the fashion, and of the images of the colonialists." Diop, Nkrumah, and Fanon were but a few prominent individuals that exposed the need for a truly independent Africa free of all forms of exploitation. The call for African unity that resounded in their efforts to expose the truth was deeply rooted in their commitment and dedication to Africa. Specifically, Nkrumah and the CPP integrated Pan-African education into New Ghana as a means of reinforcing their commitment to its eventual success. Pan-Africanism was important to Nkrumah because of his belief that it would benefit the African continent, but by default Ghana would be free outside of aggression and would find greater security. Pan-Africanism at the time of independence was certainly becoming more popular. In spite of this popularity, they were faced with transforming the hearts and minds of generations of Ghanaians. Consequently, Kwame Nkrumah and the CPP attempted to expose Ghanaians to Pan-African consciousness through both formal and informal institutions. The informal institutions included media outlets, conferences, adult education, the Kwame Nkrumah Ideological Institute, the Ghana Young Pioneer Movement, and much more. I'm now going to move to the Ghana Young Pioneer Movement. Prior to independence, there were many youth organizations operating in Ghana. Among them were the Boy Scouts from Great Britain, the Girls Guide Movement, the Catholic Youth Organization, and the Boy Brigade. These organizations were primarily